Okay, let's talk about power. The American presidency. It's arguably the most powerful job in the world. But you know what comes with great power? Yeah, great temptation. And throughout American history, the White House has been absolutely rocked by scandals that push the system to its breaking point. So today, we're going to dive right into that messy, fascinating story of presidential corruption.
So right off the bat, let's ask the big question. What does it actually mean for a president to be corrupt? I mean, when we hear that word, our minds probably jump to, shady deals, bags of cash, that kind of stuff. But it's so much more complicated than that. So what really happens when a president crosses the line? Well, as we're about to find out, the answer is not so simple.
Okay, so you can pretty much break presidential corruption down into two main buckets. On one side, you've got the classic personal greed, right? This is all about the money, the backroom deals, the bribes, using the office to get rich. But then there's this other, maybe even more serious kind, the abuse of power. This is when a president just defies the law, ignores the courts, and basically shreds the rule book. Both are definitely corruption, but they're two totally different kinds of threats to the system.
All right, so let's start with the one we all understand, the money. Greed, bribes, backroom deals. We're going to look at some presidents whose time in office was just completely swamped by financial scandals and cronyism, where making a buck seemed more important than, serving the public. And a perfect example of this, look no further than the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant himself was this celebrated Civil War hero, right? But his administration, wow, it was just one scandal after another. His buddies, the people he appointed, they were into everything. You had the gold ring scandal, where they tried to corner the entire gold market. Then there was the infamous whiskey ring. Yep, that's a real thing, where a bunch of officials and distillers were cheating on taxes. It was just a nonstop storm of accusations against the very people he put in charge.
So yeah, Grant's presidency was messy. But the scandal that really became the poster child for government greed back then, that one actually involved a different president, Warren G. Harding. And it all revolved around a place in Wyoming with a name you won't forget, Teapot Dome.
So here's the scheme in a nutshell. Harding's Secretary of the Interior, a guy named Albert Fall, he secretly leased these super valuable government oil reserves at Teapot Dome to a couple of private oil companies. No bidding, no nothing. And in return, he got paid. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes, which was a ton of money back then. Of course, Congress eventually got wind of it, the whole thing blew up, and Albert Fall went down in history for all the wrong reasons. He became the very first cabinet member to go to prison for stuff he did while in office. Wild.
Okay, so that's the money stuff. But like we said, corruption isn't always about cash. Sometimes it's about a president just challenging the whole system, defying the rule of law that they swore an oath to protect.
For our first case here, we've got to go all the way back to the super chaotic time right after the Civil War. Congress was really tense, and in 1867, they passed something called the Tenure of Office Act. The idea was pretty simple. It said the president couldn't just fire certain high-level officials, people the Senate had already approved, without getting the Senate's permission first. It was basically Congress drawing a line in the sand, a direct challenge to the president's power.
And guess what? President Andrew Johnson walked right into their trap. He went ahead and fired his Secretary of War, completely defying the new law. Well, the House immediately impeached him for it. And after this incredibly dramatic trial in the Senate, the final vote came down to just one. A single vote. That's how close Johnson came to being removed from office. It's the closest the country has ever gotten.
And this wasn't a one-off thing. Decades before Johnson, you had Andrew Jackson, who was accused of a whole different kind of defiance. So the Supreme Court ruled in a famous case that the state of Georgia couldn't just take Cherokee lands. But Jackson was all about westward expansion, and he supposedly shot back with this legendary line, basically telling the Chief Justice, "You made your ruling, now let's see you enforce it." Now, historians argue if he actually said those exact words, but the sentiment was clear. His administration basically ignored the Supreme Court, and that directly led to the tragic and forced removal of the Cherokee people.
Okay, let's fast forward to the modern era, because this is where the nature of scandals really starts to change. You've heard the saying, it's not the crime, it's the cover-up? Well, that's what this is all about. It's when the web of lies becomes an even bigger deal than whatever happened in the first place.
And there is absolutely no better example of this than Watergate. I mean, it all started with what seemed like a third-rate burglary, a clumsy break-in at the DNC headquarters. But the real scandal, the thing that brought down a president, was the cover-up. Over the next 2 years, the whole thing just unraveled, thread by thread, as investigators followed the money and the lies all the way to the top, right to President Richard Nixon himself.
And as the evidence was piling up, Nixon went on national TV and delivered one of the most iconic and infamous denials in political history. He was trying so hard to project innocence, but the whole time, the walls were closing in. And the craziest part? His own secret taping system in the White House was about to prove he was involved all along. In the end, he was facing certain impeachment and conviction. So Nixon did something no president had ever done before, or has done since. He resigned. It was the first and only presidential resignation in American history. The system was pushed to its limit, but in a way, it worked. Now fast forward a couple decades. President Bill Clinton also found himself facing impeachment, also for deception. In his case, for lying under oath about an affair. But look at the difference in the outcome. Nixon resigned because he knew he was going to be removed. Clinton, on the other hand, was impeached by the House, but then acquitted by the Senate, and he finished his term. It just goes to show you, different scandals, different times, can have totally different results.
So, we've looked at greed, we've looked at abuse of power, we've looked at deception. Which brings us to the big one. What's the ultimate price? What actually happens when a president gets accused of this stuff? How does the system hold them accountable? And does it even work?
And when you look at the numbers, a really interesting pattern pops up. So, 4 presidents have been impeached by the House. That's Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump, who was impeached twice. But look at that middle bar. How many have actually been convicted by the Senate and kicked out of office? A big fat 0. The only president to ever leave office because of a scandal was Nixon, and he jumped before he was pushed.
So let's just recap. You've got 4 presidents, 4 major scandals, and 4 completely different results. Johnson squeaks by just 1 vote. Nixon resigns, Clinton gets acquitted, Trump gets acquitted. Twice. It really shows you that this whole battle between presidential power and public accountability plays out differently every single time.
And look, this stuff isn't just trivia for a history quiz. These events are like massive case studies. Each one of them forced the entire country to ask really tough questions about power, about the law, about what we expect from a leader. They are, quite literally, real-world stress tests of American democracy and those checks and balances we hear so much about.
Which kind of leaves us with one final, huge question. In the end, who truly holds the most powerful person in the world accountable? I mean, we've seen Congress try, we've seen the courts weigh in, we've seen public pressure force a resignation. But when it all comes down to it, who's really in charge of making sure that power is kept in check? It's a question that's as relevant today as it ever was.